Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 101 of Cell and Gene, the podcast. I'm Erin Harris, and in this episode, I am pleased to be joined by Alicia Zhou, Ph.D., Chief Executive Officer of the Cancer Research Institute, or CRI. Our conversation centers on CRI's mission to advance cancer immunotherapy and the pivotal role of federal funding, particularly from the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, in supporting both basic and translational cancer research. Dr. Zhou underscores CRI's commitment to funding early-stage scientific investigations and clinical trials with the ultimate goal of advancing immunotherapies toward the cure of all cancers. She also discusses the profound implications of recent NIH budget freezes and the suspension of grant review processes, which are already exerting strain on biomedical research institutions, graduate programs, and clinical trial operations. Given the evolving nature of the federal funding landscape, it is important to note that Dr. Zhou and I recorded our discussion in late March 2025. Recognizing the rapid pace of change, I invited Dr. Zhou to provide an updated commentary on the NIH budget situation, which is included in this episode and reflects the most current information available at the time of the recording. Since that conversation, there have been notable developments as of April 15th, 2025. And so I asked Dr. Zhou to bring us up to speed so that I might deliver these to you in advance of the episode. And here they are. In February, the NIH announced plans to reduce all indirect costs to 15%. However, following legal action initiated by several state attorneys general, a federal judge issued a permanent injunction blocking the proposed changes. Significant threats to institutional funding have emerged, with universities such as Columbia, the University of Pennsylvania, and Johns Hopkins facing potential funding cancellations. Most recently, Harvard University experienced a termination of $2 billion in federal funding following its response to federal mandates. NIH study sections and scientific advisory council meetings have resumed, although it remains unclear whether operations are fully returned to normal, according to reporting by STAT. And the NIH has experienced additional layoffs, including the near total loss of its communications staff and the departure of several high-profile leaders. In response to this instability, many academic institutions have enacted hiring freezes for faculty and postdoctoral researchers and have reduced admissions for graduate programs in anticipation of constrained funding. So listeners, this episode covers a breadth of critical information. I am certain you will find Dr. Zhou's insights to be both deeply informed and highly impactful. And so without further delay, here is my conversation with Dr. Alicia Zhou of the Cancer Research Institute. Enjoy. Alicia, welcome to Cell and Gene, the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So talk to us about CRI. Tell us about its mission, your role as CEO, and just anything you would like our audience to know about Cancer Research Institute.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Cancer Research Institute is a global nonprofit organization. We've been around since 1953. And our fundamental thesis is that we believe that we can fund basic research that helps to move immunotherapy outcomes forward. And so we've always been dedicated to advancing the science of immunotherapy. And the goal here is to make it possible to cure all cancers with immunotherapy. And so you might be wondering, what's immunotherapy? The way I think about this is that immunotherapy is a way for us to activate the immune system or to treat the immune system in order to treat cancer. This is something that was relatively novel. At the time in 1953, it actually didn't exist. But of course, today, immunotherapy is now a huge pillar for cancer treatment. It's used regularly alongside with chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery to treat many cancers. And today, there are 29 cancers that are now treatable by immunotherapy. And CRI has always been very dedicated to that mission. And so the way we think about this at CRI is that we fund groundbreaking research, really in basic science. So we invest in scientists, postdoctoral fellows, mid-career scientists to ensure that they're able to do the basic science they need in order to be able to translate that towards therapeutic outcomes. We also invest on the clinical trial side. So we also invest on ensuring that these discoveries that are made at the bench can be translated eventually into those therapies that we know will be life-saving and can get into the hands of patients. So as the CEO, I'm always thinking about, where are the right places for CRI to be investing to ensure that we continue to feed this important pipeline of discovery. And then ultimately the goal is to make a world immune to cancer. Let's make sure that every cancer has the opportunity to be treated by immunotherapy and that we can have the best outcomes possible for all patients.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that explanation and for the wonderful work you do at CRI. I think, as our listeners know, I like to kind of level set the conversation to tee up what we're going to be talking about. So,
Sure.
we're here because one of the reasons we're here is because so the U.S. government has recently implemented several measures affecting NIH funding, and that includes budget cuts, funding freezes, and as of this recording, so we're recording in late March. Talk us through so our listeners understand what are those measures and what does the reduced spending, job eliminations, and fewer PhD appointments mean for biomedical research?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to set the context because it is a very quickly evolving situation. So currently in late March, where we are is that we know that there have been proposed changes to the way the NIH is going to fund biomedical research. And then there's real sort of freezes in activity that are currently happening at the NIH. So let me talk about these two different things. The first is that there's been this proposal, and it came out almost 6 weeks ago now. So this was mid-February, about the NIH proposing to reduce the amount of indirect costs for all NIH-funded grants to 15%. The indirect cost is meant to cover the facilities and administration costs. That cost usually is, for most institutions, somewhere between 30 and 70% today. So cutting that back to 15% is a pretty dramatic cut in funding. This was proposed or stated by the NIH several weeks ago, and then subsequently there's been all of the states' attorney generals actually filed a suit against this, and there's currently a federal stay on this, meaning that currently, technically, all grants are supposed to still receive the previously negotiated indirect costs, but this is something that's looming right now for all institutions, is this potential that the NIH is going to cut back on the F&A costs, the indirect costs. That's one thing. The other thing that has happened ever since the change in federal administration is that there's been a pause on almost all NIH activities. And what that means then is that there's a series of events that NIH has to undergo in order for sort of the machine of grant funding to function. These include having in-person meetings of study sections, which are sort of the scientific review scientific review sections that actually review grants. And then there's this second meeting called advisory council, scientific advisory council meetings. And those meetings, which happen once a quarter, are really meant to then approve grants. Now, because neither of these two types of meetings are happening, study sections and advisory council meetings, it essentially has caused this sort of total standstill of all NIH funding right now. And that means that folks who have submitted grants that are going to get reviewed are not getting reviewed. And then there are some grants that were reviewed prior to January and were actually told that they would be funded. But because no advisory council is meeting, there's no funding that's coming from that. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's certainly a lot of worry that there's going to be less funding from the NIH to academic centers. This has resulted in action from all of these universities. We're seeing it left and right. All sorts of universities are choosing to put hiring freezes. So we're seeing less faculty being hired. And they're also, some places are actually reducing their graduate student admissions or even rescinding graduate student admissions. So that's a pretty dramatic freeze, I would say, on our current academic medical centers and our system within the United States. And so that's sort of the current state of things right now.
Let's talk through the role that the NIH funding plays. So what role does it play, meaning NIH funding, in accelerating the development of the life-saving therapy, or excuse me, the life-saving treatments we're talking about? And how are these cuts, how might they affect the pace of medical innovation as we know it?
I mean, this is such a great question, and I've been sort of looking around for, different analyses that have started to put this into context. So I'll just share some of the analyses that I've seen. So we know right now that the NIH invests about $47 billion through the NIH into the medical research in the United States. That $47 billion investment actually fuels this very large pharma and biotech industry. It's $1.5 trillion or so for pharma and biotech total. And when I say fuels, what do I mean by that? Over the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2019, 354 of 356 FDA-approved drugs actually had their origins in NIH funding, meaning that the original sort of basic science that started it all came from NIH-funded research. So we're talking about almost 100% of all FDA-approved drugs in the last 10 years actually had their origins in NIH-funded research. So that's a pretty big contribution that the NIH is making towards basic research that gets translated into therapies. Now, that's just talking about sort of the drug development side of things. We also know that the NIH is directly supporting close to 500,000 jobs, but on top of that, there's 2 million, 3 million jobs in biotech and pharma that are also sort of part of this ecosystem. And I think it's important that we talk about this in the context of that ecosystem. You can't just isolate the NIH itself and not think about the knock-on effects for pharma, for cancer care, for medical care, medical training. All of these things are actually interconnected. And so in order to be able to talk about the NIH, you do have to talk about all of these other things. So with that in mind, then what you're really thinking about is the NIH actually is a really great investment of the American government. I saw one economic analysis that says that $1 of the NIH investment actually results in a $2.4, $2.5 return for the US economy. So $1 in gets you $2.5 out. So there's actually an ROI on that. And so that's really sort of the place when we think about the NIH, this is sort of the value that it has to the American people.
Of course, of course. And okay, so you were talking about the fact that, NIH's $47 billion budget is allocated to grants and funding for research institutions. Okay. How will these cuts directly affect cancer research project and clinical trials, ongoing clinical trials? And, are there any specific areas of immunotherapy or oncology research that could be hardest hit?
This is a really great question because it's actually hard to sort of tease this all out. So let's think about this in sort of pieces. So right now, what we're seeing is that there's definitely federal budget cuts that have directly affected cancer research. These budget cuts haven't actually come through the NIH. They've actually, as of today, making sure that things are going to evolve by the time this podcast potentially actually goes live. But as of late March, what we know is that there is actually some funding that's in the Department of Defense that's always been for cancer research. And as of now, that budget, the budget for medical research as part of the Department of Defense funding has been cut by about 50%. So there's actually direct cancer research that's being affected. There are cancellations of grants, there's non-renewals of grants, and we're seeing that happening already today just because of those cuts that are happening. And then let's talk about the NIH. So where we are with the NIH, we know that there are certain grants that are being canceled. Where we are today is that we know there are certain institutions that have been that have been targeted for this. Right now, we've heard that Columbia has lost a large amount of funding, and UPenn is also potentially going to lose a good amount of funding. And the interesting thing is that the funding that's being cut is very much biomedical research funding, which is not. It doesn't really make sense to me why that's the place that they're being gone after, but we know there's direct funding cuts that are happening. So that's one thing that's happening. Then the question is, what's the effect on clinical trials? So a couple of things to think about here. The indirect costs, which I talked about at the top, this is something that right now every NIH grant that is granted, for every dollar that is spent towards direct costs, there is some percentage that is then given for indirect costs, and this is for facilities and administration. So right now, when you have a clinical trial, for example, for every dollar of direct funding for the actual clinical trial, there's usually something like, let's call it 50 cents, 50 to 70 cents that are then added on top of that for administration cost. With a clinical trial, you need a lot of extra support. You need, obviously, the facilities themselves. You're going to be recruiting patients. There are infusion centers you have to pay for, but there's also the recruitment staff. There's all the logistics of being consented into a study. There's all the need for the support for the actual clinical trial, and none of those dollars are currently being funded in that direct cost. All of that is actually in the indirect. So without that kind of robust support for the indirect cost, you are going to see clinical trials needing to redo the math on how many patients they can recruit. And then you're going to see institutions redo the math on how many clinical trials they can actually support. So I think you are going to see a contraction in clinical trials. The last thing you asked was about sort of the direct impact in immuno-oncology. So this is really interesting because for us in the immuno-oncology space, when we talk about immuno-oncology, there's many different types of drugs and agents and mechanisms that can be used to treat cancer. There are sort of antibody treatments. There are these treatments called checkpoint inhibitors that have been very useful for the field and for pharma. And then more recently, there's been a really interesting discoveries on the cancer vaccine side. And this is really thinking about how do we sort of use vaccine technology actually to treat cancers. Now, what's unfortunate is that because of the fact that the current new administration has a point of view about vaccines, and specifically about mRNA vaccines, there is potentially a detrimental effect towards cancer vaccine work because cancer vaccines actually use mRNA technology as well. So there's all sorts of places where we're seeing this directly affecting cancer research.
Oh boy. Okay. So the next thing I want to ask you about is sort of the same question, but from the patient perspective. How will these budget cuts potentially impact patients, particularly those who are relying on emerging treatments and clinical trials? So, you know, what what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we all hope that there isn't going to be an immediate effect on patients, but it's really hard to say. So a couple of things for us to consider here. There are a lot of clinical trials that are being run. Many of them are being run at academic medical centers. In addition, actually, the NIH itself employs investigators, and the NIH itself actually funds and runs clinical trials. Now, we know the NIH itself has sustained some pretty dramatic staffing cuts and reorgs within itself. So the question is, if you are part of an NIH-funded trial, or if you're supposed to be enrolled in an NIH-sponsored trial, meaning the NIH themselves are the ones who are actually doing that trial, what does that actually mean? Are you going to be able to enter that trial if you're in a trial? Because usually when you're in a trial, it's longitudinal. It's not just sort of one point in time. So maybe you're halfway through the trial, or maybe you just started on that trial. What's the long-term sustainability of that trial? It's really unclear. I think the hope is that anything that's already live today, hopefully gets to continue, but we don't know. I think the other question then is the longer term effects on this. And certainly, I think you're going to see less clinical trials being launched because they are incredibly expensive. And so we really need to start thinking about how are these things going to get funded in the future. And unfortunately, I think the patients are the ones who lose out the most because they're the ones who are going to have less options for treatment.
Yeah, sure. Now, many experts are arguing that disruptions in NIH funding could set back scientific progress by a generation, which seems, I don't want to state it seems almost dramatic, but it's not, right? How do you see these cuts perhaps impacting the training and retention of early career scientists? And what long-term effects do you foresee maybe on the future of cancer research based on all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of pieces of this. So the NIH supports many of our academic medical research centers and universities. And these are the pipelines for all of our trainees. This is how folks get their knowledge and their training. And it's sort of the way that it works, right? You go to medical school or you go to graduate school and you get your MD or your PhD. I think in the United States, we're talking about 29,000 MDs a year, 8 to 10,000 PhDs every year. And these folks are being trained at and are coming out of these NIH supported medical research centers and universities and med schools. So without that kind of NIH support, you are seeing already today that direct impact on the training pipeline. So where we're seeing it today is we're seeing graduate student admissions are being halted. Some are being rescinded. Some graduate students' classes are being cut back. What we know is that, about 60 to 70% of PhDs actually end up going into non-academic jobs. So, a biology PhD is sort of the table stakes to being a scientist right now in this industry. Once you get your PhD, you have your choice of what you want to do in your career. We're seeing about 60 to 70% of PhD students after they graduate are not going on to do academic research, but actually going into pharma and into the private sector or into doing other types of jobs. So this is really a training pipeline that feeds an entirely very large ecosystem, right? And so, what we know is pharma biotech, they employ about 2 million people, maybe 3 million people a year. So imagine what that does to their sort of pipeline when it comes to the careers of young scientists that are going to eventually end up in those positions. So this is when we talk about sort of the threat to a generation of scientists. This is what we mean, because we're not going to feel it tomorrow, but the fact that we are cutting back on PhD training programs today means that in 10 to 15 years, we are going to feel the pain of that. And we're going to see that directly in terms of the number of qualified individuals who are able to take those jobs, as well as the amount of innovation that's coming out of this sector in terms of new ideas, novel discoveries, things that can help propel this field. So we're not going to see it tomorrow, but we will feel these effects in a decade from now.
Of course. And to your point from earlier, which is ultimately affecting and impacting the patient in that time frame too. Well, here's the good news. So Cancer Research Institute has pledged $2.5 million from its own reserve to fund 10 additional postdoc fellowships. So talk to us about this. Please elaborate on how these fellowships will help mitigate the effects of the NIH budget cuts. And, kind of on top of that, what criteria are being used to select researchers for these positions?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. And I'm so incredibly proud of this initiative. At the Cancer Research Institute, we've always had a history of funding basic science researchers. And I think there are two sort of flagship programs for CRI that I think are really important for the immuno-oncology immunotherapy space. The first is our postdoctoral fellowship program, and it's something that we've had for decades. Having a CRI fellowship allows you to have your entire stipend covered during the 3 years that you're on that fellowship. So as a postdoc, it means that that you have funding for those 3 years. And if you are a PI, a principal investigator who's employing that postdoc, it means that that the budget for that postdoc's salary is coming out of this fellowship, which means that you can actually free up more of your budget to pay for other things. So this has been a really important program and something that we have been investing in for, like I said, decades. This year, we decided and decided only a couple of weeks ago that we're going to increase the number of postdoctoral fellows that we're going to award over the next year. And we're going to increase that by 10. And that's about a 30% increase for us. So we're adding another $2.5 million in order to do this. That brings our total investment in postdoctoral fellows for the year to about $11.2 million. And the goal here is really to help address this very specific sort of training program, right? So we know postdoc fellows are folks who have gotten their PhD and now they're doing their sort of postdoctoral training. Usually after your postdoc, you go on to become junior faculty, you go on to the job search to become an academic research professor or to go into industry. And so for us here, we know that the postdocs are the ones that are feeling it right now because they are supposed to be at that phase in their career where they are at the end of their training and they're preparing to hit the job market and join the workforce. And then now there's all this massive uncertainty about what that even sort of workforce looks like and what their career trajectory looks like. And I've heard from young scientists that they've sort of had to think differently about what they were originally planning for their careers. So we felt it was really important to be investing in this particular generation of scientists at this level. And so by being able to do additional postdoctoral fellows, we hope we can directly impact these individuals by giving them funding stability. But then also there's sort of the ecosystem level effect of by funding a postdoc fellow, you are making it possible for that PI to then also free up that budget to spend towards other important research topics. And so that's the goal. In terms of how we're selecting our criteria, this is something that we're always proud of at CRI. So we have an esteemed panel of scientific advisory council members that's led by Nobel laureate Jim Allison, who's really the giant in our field for immunotherapy. And so all of our postdoctoral fellowships are actually reviewed through our Scientific Advisory Council fellowship committee members. These are individuals who are experts in this field, and they will read all of the postdoc fellowship grant applications and they will score them. So it's all merit-based, very similar actually to the way the NIH does their grant reviews. And it's always been actually a very competitive process at CRI. We fund currently around 8% of all of our applicants. So it's actually very competitive to get a CRI fellowship. Because we're going to be increasing the number, we'll see if that means we can start funding more of the sort of the percentage, but we also might see many more applicants. So it's hard to say, but it is merit-based, and it's our external scientific advisory review committee that determines who gets these fellowships.
Well, remarkable. All of it is extremely important and very effective, and we're very happy that you're doing this. But given the need for philanthropic and institutional funding to fill that gap, do you see CRI or other organizations expanding funding initiatives in the future? And then I guess a follow-up question to that would be, is it a sustainable model, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think one thing I want to be really clear about is the NIH is a fundamentally essential component of this equation. So there's no world in which American biomedical research is sustained without NIH. Where nonprofit and private funders can play a role right now is that we are also additional funders for the work. And so we can certainly step up in these moments. And that's what we're doing. And I think there are our peer organizations that will also be stepping up to do this, I'm sure. And so I do think that there's a different sort of math that we need to do. I think we need to ask ourselves, and there's certainly uncertainty right now. So that's part of why we don't really know. But I think here are the data that I'm looking for. As of yesterday, we now have a Senate confirmed new NIH director, Jay Bhattacharya. And so we've been waiting for that because the NIH didn't have a director until now. So now that we have a confirmed NIH director, I think we're all waiting to see how he talks about his priorities and what he thinks are the funding priorities for the NIH. The other piece of data that we're looking for is to understand how Congress sees the NIH in its overall federal budget, right? So in March, we saw a continuing resolution passed, but in September, we expect to see Congress really put a number to the NIH. And that will tell us a little bit more in terms of how much federal investment is going to come into the NIH and into biomedical research. With those data points, I think then we as private foundation funders will need to understand and do the math on what we need to be doing. Certainly, if there's a need for us to be funding at a higher level or to be doing more, I think that's a challenge for us and for us to step up to the line. And that's a challenge I'm willing to meet. But I do think that it's always going to be in partnership with public funding for biomedical research. There's no world in which it is sustained entirely by private funding. So the sustainability definitely depends on the NIH being able to be that strong partner.
Gotcha. from an economic perspective and without being, economists here, what would you say are the economic consequences that these funding cuts might actually have, considering the innovation in biotech and pharmaceutical industries and the jobs that it takes, the jobs roles that are needed to make that happen. How significant is NIH funded research to the overall US economy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of knock-on effects for this. And I think that's the thing about I think of the NIH as sort of the foundational support for a lot of the work that's done in the biomedical sector. But here's a couple of numbers for us to consider. So for every $100 million of funding that NIH supports, it generates about 76 patents for the United States. So there's a direct economic value to that. And you can sort of extrapolate how those patents go on to be an engine for return on investment. But that's sort of the direct math on that. We know that, as I mentioned, almost 100% of FDA-approved drugs over the last 10 years had their origin in NIH-funded research. So we know that that's also a place where the investment is clear. I think that we are quite worried, really, about the innovation side of things too. So at the end of the day, the biopharma industry is really fueled by the basic discovery that happens at the bench. The way I think about it is sort of the academic research is responsible for some of the basic knowledge that we can gain, and then industry then applies that knowledge towards therapies and towards medicines. But the basic research side of this is really important. A great example of this is that CRISPR was discovered because it's this very weird sort of mechanism that bacteria use to fight off viruses. This is sort of a almost niche part of microbiology that discovered CRISPR. It was not an investment from a pharma company that discovered it. It was absolutely basic research that led to that. Now that technology is now enabling so many applications in the biopharma industry. So it's a very balanced ecosystem. And so I do think, if we see a reduction in investment on the research side, we are going to see knock-on effects on the innovation side.
Yeah, sure. And no, I know, just a minute ago you said how, okay, there's not a world in which, the biopharma industry, proceeds and succeeds without the NIH. And so do you have concerns that shifting reliance on non-governmental sources, could that change the focus of scientific research?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a couple of things are happening. So, what's the direct impact of sort of the decreased investment in research? I've heard directly from scientists that are now in this position where they're facing funding cuts. They're asking themselves a very hard question of, what do I cut? And so what they're choosing to cut is they're choosing to cut some of the more sort of far-reaching, riskier, more innovative projects. They're more focused on the things that they think are going to be sort of a much more sure bet and a much more clear return. It's really important that researchers are able to demonstrate their progress by publishing papers and getting those sort of next steps of knowledge into the world. And so basically anything that isn't going to result in a publication very quickly is probably being deprioritized. And also sort of the high risk, high reward projects are definitely being deprioritized because you just don't know if there's going to be an ROI on that. So that's a huge problem. Then the question is, what happens if we sort of privatize research? And so, of course, on the industry side, you can invest in research, but let's think about it this way. Let's say we have two companies that are in a space and they want to develop drugs. Right now, the way it works is that the basic science is funded by the NIH. There's some academic medical centers that are doing that. The research is completed, it's published, it's put into sort of the public knowledge base. And then both company A and company B are able to work together separately in competition with each other to develop the drugs. if you have that basic research happening within the companies themselves, now we're behind closed doors. Now you have duplication of efforts that are happening across two different companies. And then ultimately the data that are coming out end up being sort of not shared with the greater community. This is actually super inefficient, not to mention really bad for science. And so I think these are the effects that we're going to see if you start to have too many if you pull the research into sort of the industry side of things.
Yeah, sure. That makes perfect sense. All right, just a couple more final questions for you. So beyond CRI's immediate response, to our listeners, to the broader scientific and patient advocacy, communities out there, how do they protect and sustain biomedical research funding? And then second to that, are there policy initiatives or advocacy efforts in motion to counteract the cuts that are going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's always been really great about the United States is the ability of an individual voice to affect change. And I think there's a lot of things that are happening here, but ultimately we have to recognize that each of us has the opportunity and the ability to do something about it. So advocacy, I think, is incredibly important. I think it's important to speak up about your belief in science and the importance of science to everything, right? And as a scientist, I proudly wear that badge. But I think there's absolutely the opportunity for individuals to contribute their voices. There are often these rallies for science or marches for science that happen. I think it's important to be able to show up for those and contribute and be a part of that. I think at the same time, we know that these initiatives and these policies are implemented at the state and federal levels. And so, looking into your local situation, understanding who are the stakeholders, who are your representatives, who can you call and talk to be able to tell them what your priorities are. The reality is that cancer research has always been a bipartisan supported effort. And what we're talking about today here is not about politics. It's not about being on one side or on the other side of the aisle. What we're talking about is sustaining the investment in biomedical research. And that's something that's never been controversial for anybody on any side of this, of the political spectrum. And so with that in mind, I think it's important to remind policymakers that, yes, there are all of these initiatives that are happening to think about how to drive more efficiency within the federal government. And that's something that's worth doing to ensure that there isn't bloat within the federal government. But at the same time, let's ensure that there isn't collateral damage to some of these programs and initiatives that we know are so important to us, including cancer research. And I think that's something I hope everyone can get behind.
Absolutely. All in for patient access, the patient journey, and the patient themselves for sure. All right, and with that, we're at the end of our episode. I want to sincerely thank Cancer Research Institute's Alicia Zhou for her time and insight. Alicia, this was wonderful. Thank you for all of the great information you shared with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Good. And thank you to listeners for tuning in to Cell and Gene, the podcast. We'll talk to you soon.